On a quiet morning in the neighborhood, a police officer who had worked for many years to live there decided that Calvin Ramsey didn't belong. Officer Vance Pruitt saw a black man in old clothes next to a beautiful car and made a decision without calling dispatch, without probable cause, without a single fact to stand on, turning Calvin's morning into something neither of them would ever forget. He had no idea that the man washing his Chevelle in that driveway had spent over 2 decades as a detective sergeant for the Garland City Police Department. He had no idea that the worn leather wallet in the back pocket of those paint-splattered work pants held a gold shield that was about to end Pruitt's career, his pension, and his freedom. He had no idea that what he was about to do in a quiet cul-de-sac on that morning would dismantle not just himself, but the entire network that had protected him for some time. Stick around because what happened in that driveway is the most expensive mistake a cop in this city has ever made. The morning had arrived the way good mornings are supposed to, quietly without agenda, without the sharp, intrusive bark of an alarm clock or the particular dread that comes from knowing the day belongs to someone else. Cedarwood Heights had settled into its weekend rhythm. Sprinklers ticked across manicured lawns. The smell of someone's bacon drifted from an open kitchen window 2 houses down. A pair of mockingbirds argued in the ancient live oak that split the Wills property from the sidewalk, their bickering carrying that cheerful, indignant quality that made it impossible to take seriously. Somewhere around the bend of the cul-de-sac, a child was attempting to ride a bicycle with training wheels, the aluminum frame scraping the asphalt in unsteady, determined arcs. It was the kind of morning that reminded a man of why he worked as hard as he did. Calvin Ramsey stood in his driveway in a pair of paint-splattered work pants that had survived 3 garage renovation projects, a grass-staining incident involving the back fence, and one particularly ill-advised attempt at refinishing hardwood floors. The pants were beyond saving as anything presentable, which made them perfect for the task at hand. His shirt was a faded Howard University tee, the bison logo cracked and softened by decades of washing until the cotton had achieved that ideal worn-in texture that made expensive new shirts seem like a fraud. His feet were in a pair of old canvas sneakers, the right one bearing a permanent streak of sapphire green paint along the toe from the afternoon when the Chevelle's final color coat had been applied. The Chevelle. Calvin paused, sponge in hand, and just looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has built from almost nothing. The 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle SS sat on the concrete with the particular presence of a vehicle that has been brought back from the dead through patience, stubbornness, and a great deal of money that Loretta had never asked him to account for directly, though they both understood the accounting was happening somewhere in the background of their marriage. He had found the car some years ago at an estate sale, a widow in East Garland selling off decades of her late husband's hobby. The Chevelle buried under tarps, an oxidized regret in the back corner of a detached garage, its original engine missing, its body riddled with rust pockets. The paint so faded it looked more like a memory of a color than an actual one. The man who sold it to him that day thought Calvin was being sentimental and impractical. The man had not been entirely wrong, but now the Chevelle sat gleaming in the late morning light like a promise kept. The restoration had taken some years, working only on weekends and occasional evenings, sourcing parts from specialists in 3 different states, rebuilding the 396 cubic inch engine himself with the help of a retired machinist named Elton, who lived in the neighborhood's East Block and had strong opinions about everything. The paint, deep midnight green, not the original color, but the color Calvin had always imagined when he was a boy watching cars like this move through neighborhoods he had not yet been allowed to live in, had been applied in a climate-controlled shop downtown by a painter named Gus, who treated the work with the solemnity of someone painting a cathedral ceiling. The chrome bumpers were Calvin's particular obsession. He polished them every morning that the weather allowed, the rhythmic circular motion of the chamois cloth against the metal serving as something between meditation and prayer. This morning he had started early, working through the Carnauba wax application with the slow, methodical care of a man who had nowhere else to be and no desire to be there. The garage radio played Otis Redding, sitting on the dock of the bay. Loretta had appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee, the way she always did, wearing her house coat and her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, and she had stood there watching him work with an expression that lived somewhere between affection and resigned amusement. "You know that car is cleaner than our kitchen floor," she said. "Our kitchen floor doesn't get compliments," Calvin replied without looking up. She laughed a short, warm sound and went back inside. Calvin Ramsey was a man who had spent over 2 decades on the Garland City Police Department, decades of homicide scenes and court appearances and budget meetings, and the particular emotional weight that comes from spending your working days inside the worst moments of other people's lives. He had started as a patrol officer, made detective, which his mother had called finally, while his father, who drove a city bus for decades, had simply nodded and said, "Good. Now watch your back," and made detective sergeant, leading the Major Crimes Division in a unit that closed its cases at a rate that had drawn commendations from the chief's office. He had been passed over for lieutenant twice. The first time the position had gone to a less experienced officer with better political connections. The second time, Chief Lena Hargrove had offered him a private apology that he had accepted without enthusiasm. He had not applied a third time. He had asked for the transfer to Major Crimes, buried himself in the work, and decided that the view from the place he had carved out for himself was better than the chair someone else had decided he wasn't supposed to sit in. The house at the end of Maplewood Court, a 4-bedroom craftsman with a covered porch in a backyard deep enough that the neighbors' noise became theoretical, had taken him and Loretta some years to afford. They had bought it after their younger daughter finished college, and the moment Calvin turned the key in the front door lock for the first time, something in his chest settled that he hadn't realized was still waiting to settle. He was a man who had earned his place in the world in the specific, granular way that leaves no room for ambiguity. He owned the house, he owned the car, he owned the morning. He did not see the patrol cruiser immediately. He became aware of it the way you become aware of a change in the quality of light before you identify its cause. A slight shift in the atmosphere of the morning, the mockingbirds going quiet in the live oak, the particular sound of tires moving too slowly for a car with anywhere to be. He was working his way around to the front bumper, the Otis Redding giving way to a Percy Sledge record, when the slow crawl of an engine at the edge of his peripheral vision registered with the part of his brain that had been trained over decades to notice things that didn't belong. He did not turn around immediately. He kept working the chamois cloth over the chrome in steady circles, but the ease had gone out of his hands. The morning was the same morning it had been moments ago. Same mockingbirds, same smell of wax and concrete, same Percy Sledge. But something had entered it that changed its character entirely. Calvin knew that feeling. He had felt it since he was a boy. He kept his hands moving and waited to see what came next. Officer Vance Pruitt turned his cruiser onto Maplewood Court with the loose, comfortable authority of a man who has never genuinely questioned his right to be anywhere. He was a man with a jaw that looked engineered for argument, a military-style haircut kept just past its last trim, and eyes that moved across a landscape the way a metal detector moves across a beach, not expecting nothing but calibrated to find something, and unsatisfied until it did. He had been on the Garland City Police Department for some years, which was long enough to have formed very settled opinions about how the world worked and who belonged where within it, and not quite long enough to have faced any consequence serious enough to disturb those opinions. He had transferred to the Cedarwood Heights patrol sector some time ago. The transfer had been in the politely evasive language of departmental personnel management, initiated by mutual agreement following a review of Officer Pruitt's assignment compatibility with his current precinct environment. What this meant in plain terms was that the East Side Precinct Commander, Captain Felix Drury, had spent months documenting Pruitt's behavior with the patience of a man building a legal case, and had finally told the district commander that he would not continue to absorb the liability. Multiple use of force complaints, all involving black male civilians, all dismissed before reaching formal review, all carrying the same institutional fingerprints. Captain Curtis Langford of the police union had appeared at the relevant administrative hearings with prepared statements and a practiced expression of measured indignation, and had walked each complaint to the edge of formal review and then guided it quietly into the filing cabinet where careers were protected. Pruitt knew Langford the way certain people know their insurance agent, not with genuine warmth, but with the particular comfortable reliance of someone who has made a claim before and found the process smooth. The East Side transfer had felt like a punishment for some time. By the end of the first week in Cedarwood Heights, Pruitt had revised his assessment. Cedarwood Heights was opportunity. The neighborhood was one of the older affluent sectors of Garland, not gated, not patrolled by private security, but prosperous in that established oak-shaded way that comes from property values built on decades of exclusion. Quiet neighborhoods got complacent. Complacent neighborhoods bred opportunity. Proactive policing, his phrase repeated often in the precinct break room, was the responsible response. His patrol partner that morning, a young officer named Jamie Briggs, who was still in his first year and still possessed of the rookie's fundamental desire not to make anything worse, had called in sick. Pruitt was running solo. He had not reported this to dispatch before beginning his patrol, which was another one of the small procedural corners he had been cutting since the transfer. Because corners existed to be cut when no one significant was watching. He turned onto Maplewood Court, and his eyes found the driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac, with the efficiency of a man whose biases had been doing his seeing for him for years. He processed the scene in pieces. The neighborhood affluent, quiet, the kind of street where certain people were expected. The car a restored Chevelle SS, midnight green. The kind of vehicle that suggested either old money, professional income, or criminal enterprise, depending on who was standing behind it. The man, black, broad-shouldered in worn work clothes, leaning into the driver's side with a cloth in his hand. The man's clothes did not match the car. In Pruitt's particular calculus, this was the entire case. He did not think, here is a man washing his car. He did not think, here is a homeowner on a morning. The thought that formed instantly, automatically, without any of the deliberate reasoning he would later describe it as, was the thought of a predator identifying something to pursue. He reached for his radio, considered calling the stop into dispatch, and did not. There was a vague quality of satisfaction in the decision, not a small act of operational autonomy that felt like ownership of the moment. He activated his lights without the siren. The silent, aggressive strobing of the emergency bar, painting the oak trees in Calvin's driveway in frantic blue and red, designed to disorient and turn the cruiser into the driveway, blocking the exit. He sat in the car before getting out, watching. The man in the driveway had not turned around, had not flinched, had not made a run for it. He was still working the cloth over the front bumper in steady circles, as though the police lights illuminating his driveway were not his immediate concern. That steadiness annoyed Pruitt in a specific way he couldn't quite name. He got out of the cruiser with the practiced, deliberate weight of a man who has learned that physical presence can carry a message before a word is spoken. His right hand settling near the duty belt with the casual proximity that conveyed a threat while falling just short of making one. He walked toward the man in the driveway, and everything about the morning changed. Calvin heard the cruiser door open and the particular creak of a loaded duty belt settling as the officer stood. He heard the footsteps on the concrete, heavy, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who was not approaching with service in mind. He placed the chamois cloth carefully on the roof of the Chevelle and turned around. The officer was white, with the kind of build that comes from intermittent gym attendance and an excess of confidence in what the build implies. His name tag read Pruitt. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but his jaw was set in a particular arrangement of muscle and certainty that Calvin had seen enough times to classify immediately. Not the jaw of a man who is curious, the jaw of a man who has already decided. Calvin's hands were at his sides, open, visible. He had learned the habit of visible hands before he had learned long division. Taught by a father who understood the curriculum that black children in this country receive alongside their other education. "Morning, officer," Calvin said. His voice was calm and deep, the voice of a man with no particular urgency in any direction. "Is there a problem?" "Step away from the vehicle." Pruitt's voice carried the flatness of a manufactured authority, not naturally commanding, but practiced. He stopped about 8 feet away, feet planted wide, right hand resting near his holster. Calvin took one deliberate step back from the Chevelle, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "I'm away from the car. What can I do for you?" "Whose car is this?" Pruitt moved closer, stopping at roughly 5 feet, crowding the personal space in the way designed to produce a flinch. His eyes moved over the Chevelle, then came back to Calvin's work clothes. "Mine," Calvin said. "And what are you doing with it?" Calvin glanced at the bucket of soapy water sitting beside his left foot, the chamois cloth on the roof, the garden hose coiled on the concrete. He looked back at Pruitt. "I'm washing it. I would think that's fairly obvious." Something shifted behind the sunglasses. "Don't get smart with me. I asked whose car this is. This is a very expensive vehicle for someone dressed like that." The words landed with the casual, almost absent quality of a phrase that has been used enough times that the speaker no longer registers its specific cruelty. Calvin felt the familiar bitter sting, the feeling he had spent decades learning to metabolize quickly. He had been fighting this from inside the department, through every available institutional channel, and from outside it by being exactly who he was in the places he was supposed to be. He made the decision in that moment with the deliberate clarity he applied to investigative decisions at crime scenes. He would not show his badge. Not yet. He wanted to see what Pruitt was fully and completely, without the variable of rank changing the calculation. He wanted to see how a man like this treated a man he believed to be without protection, without recourse, without the institutional weight of a gold shield to throw on the scale. He was in some part of his mind that had never entirely stopped being a detective gathering evidence. "It's my car," Calvin said quietly. "This is my driveway. My name is on the registration in the glove box and on the deed to this house." "Your house?" Pruitt repeated in a tone that made the two words a question dressed as a statement. He looked up the manicured street with the expression of a man who has caught something in a lie. "We get a lot of break-in reports in this area. High-value vehicles getting scoped out. I'm going to need to see some identification." "Am I suspected of a crime, Calvin asked. His tone had shifted slightly, not hostile, but carrying a new precision, the interrogative edge of a trained investigator. "I'm investigating a suspicious person." "Washing a car in your own driveway is not suspicious," Calvin replied. "It is when you won't cooperate." Pruitt took another step forward. "Give me your ID or we are going to have a very different kind of conversation." Two houses down, Marjorie Caldwell had stopped pulling weeds. She was standing at her garden fence now, a small woman with silver hair and the upright posture of someone who had spent decades in a classroom and never entirely left it. She was watching the driveway with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who has lived long enough to recognize what they're seeing and has decided not to look away. Calvin did not look at her. He looked at Pruitt. "Officer," he said, "under the Fourth Amendment and the state stop and identify statutes, you cannot compel me to identify myself without reasonable and articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime. Being a black man in work clothes next to a restored vehicle does not meet that legal standard. I suspect you know that." The statement landed in the driveway between them with the quiet weight of a rock dropped into still water. Pruitt was still for a moment. Patrol officers did not frequently encounter civilians who deployed Terry stop precedent in driveway conversations with the calm delivery of someone reading from a manual. To a different officer, to a better officer, the specificity of Calvin's response might have given pause. But Pruitt was not a different officer, and the pause did not lead to recalibration. It led somewhere else. "We got a lawyer here," he said, and the sneer in it was complete and ugly. He stepped forward again, closing the distance, close enough that Calvin could smell the stale coffee and the artificial mint gum Pruitt was working at the corner of his jaw. "Listen to me very carefully. You don't tell me what the law is. I am the law out here. I caught you casing this property. You are trespassing." "Trespassing on my own property," Calvin said. His voice remained steady, an anchor in the storm of manufactured chaos. "Give me your ID," Pruitt said, his voice dropping into a threatening register, "or we are going to have a very different kind of conversation." Calvin did not step back. He stood exactly where he was and looked at the officer in front of him, and he measured the distance between what he could see in the man's body, the tightness in the shoulders, the flushed neck, the hand hovering above the duty belt, and where this was going. He kept his hands visible. He kept his voice level, and he began the internal work of building the case. The license plate check took a short time. Calvin watched Pruitt walk back to the cruiser, prop the door open, and run the Chevelle's plates through the mobile data terminal. He was positioned at the right angle to see the reflection in the passenger window, and he watched Pruitt read the result. The car came back registered to Calvin A. Ramsey, the address of the house behind him. Clean, no flags, no stolen vehicle report, no record of any kind. Calvin watched Pruitt sit with this information for some seconds. Then Pruitt climbed back out of the car. "Vehicle comes back registered," he said, approaching the driveway again. "I still need to verify occupancy of the residence. There's been a pattern of squatting in this area, people presenting fraudulent documentation, occupying properties under false pretenses. He said it with the smooth delivery of a man who has learned that if you state an invented justification with enough confidence, enough people won't question it. I'm going to need you to step away from the property while I conduct a welfare check on the residents. Calvin looked at him for a long moment. Step away from my property while I conduct a welfare check. Standard procedure when occupancy cannot be verified. Occupancy has been verified. My name matches the registration. You ran the plates yourself. Vehicle ownership and residential occupancy are two separate issues, Pruitt said with the tone of a man reciting policy he was inventing in real time. He moved between Calvin and the front door of the house, a physical repositioning that had no legitimate purpose and every illegitimate one. He was using his body the way a person might use a word they don't have to fill a space where an argument should be. Calvin did not try to walk around him. He stood still. He cataloged the move, added it to what he was building. Officer Pruitt, he said, and the use of the name read directly from the name tag was itself a small and deliberate message. There is no legitimate basis for what you are describing. This is my home. My wife is inside. I have owned this property for some years. I can provide a mortgage statement, utility bills, a driver's license, and 4 neighbors who will confirm my identity in moments. But what I am not going to do is step away from my own house while you conduct a search of it without cause or warrant. You're obstructing an active investigation. You do not have an active investigation. You have a clean plate return and a resident who is cooperating within the lawful bounds of what he is required to cooperate with. I determine what's lawful here. Pruitt's voice dropped an octave, taking on the register of a threat, carefully staying on the near side of explicit. Not you. Across the street, Sawyer Tillman, grandson of a woman who lived 4 houses down, visiting for the weekend, had stopped walking his grandmother's dog. He was standing at the opposite curb with his phone lifted, the screen glowing in his hand, the camera facing the driveway. He had started recording at the moment Pruitt repositioned between Calvin and the front door. Down at Marjorie Caldwell's fence, Marjorie had not moved. She was watching with her arms folded across her chest, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and her expression carrying the specific weight of a woman who has seen this scenario resolved badly more than once in her lifetime. Calvin kept his eyes on Pruitt. He kept building the case. It was the look toward the house that did it. Pruitt's eyes moved from Calvin's face to the front door of the house, moved there with the specific, considering slowness of a man identifying a pressure point, and then a new quality entered the confrontation, something colder and more calculated. You said your wife is inside, Pruitt said. Calvin's answer was measured. She is. Anyone else? Kids? Guests? That's not information I'm required to provide. Pruitt nodded slowly as though a thought were forming, and he wanted Calvin to watch it form. He reached for the radio on his shoulder, not to call for backup. Not yet, just held the mic between his fingers, a prop in the specific theater of implied consequence. Here's the thing, Pruitt said, and his voice had shifted into a register that Calvin recognized immediately as deliberate. Not rage, not frustration, something colder than either. The voice of a man who has found the lever and intends to use it. When I get a call about a suspicious person at a residence, and I cannot verify occupancy, and the occupant is being uncooperative, there are protocols I have to follow. One of those protocols involves notifying city welfare services for a safety check of anyone present in the building. He paused. Let that breathe. That means anyone inside needs to be able to verify their own residency. If they can't, if the documentation doesn't check out, there can be an emergency removal pending investigation. He shrugged a slow and obscene gesture of unconcern. It's a process. He said the last word with the particular unconcerned casualness of a man who knows the process will not be applied to him. Messy process, takes time, stressful for everybody involved. The morning stopped, not figuratively. Calvin felt the time do something that it only does in moments of genuine extremity, a thickening of the air, a slowing of the world's movement, the specific sensation of a threat arriving with enough weight to alter gravity. Loretta was inside that house. He heard her moving in the kitchen, the familiar percussion of her morning, the sound of her pouring a second cup of coffee, the specific rhythm of the woman he had spent decades building a life with. And Pruitt had just pointed at all of it. At her. At the years of mortgage payments, and the four-bedroom craftsman, and the kitchen floor that was cleaner than the Chevelle, and the woman who had made that joke with a laugh that still lived in the air of this driveway. Emergency removal. Calvin understood exactly what those two words meant, applied to a black woman inside a house in a wealthy neighborhood by an officer who had already demonstrated he would invent whatever pretext he needed. He understood what it would look like, what it would feel like, what it would cost her in ways that no eventual exoneration could entirely repay. He stood perfectly still. He did not raise his voice. He did not move his hands. He stood in his driveway, in his paint-splattered work pants, and let the full weight of what Pruitt had just threatened settle through him the way cold settles through a building at night, slowly, completely into every room. And somewhere beneath the cold, something clarified. Not rage. Rage was a luxury that the situation could not afford. What clarified was something more like purpose, the specific crystalline resolve that Calvin had seen on the faces of people who had been pushed past the point where accommodation was possible and had arrived at the place beyond it where something permanent needed to happen. This man had just threatened Loretta. This ends here. Not just today, not just Pruitt, the whole architecture of it. Langford's protection, the dismissed complaints, the people whose names were in that personnel file. All of it ends here. Ends today and ends in a way that matters long after this driveway. Pruitt was looking at him with the expression of a man waiting to watch something break. Calvin did not break. "Officer Sterling," he said, using the wrong name deliberately, watching for the flicker of confusion. And there it was, a small narrowing of the eyes behind the sunglasses. "Excuse me, Pruitt. I would like you to call a supervisor to this scene." "I don't need a supervisor. I'd like you to call one anyway." Pruitt let out a short, contemptuous sound. "What you'd like, Shane," he said, "is to make this harder than it needs to be. Give me your ID. I verify the occupancy. Everybody goes about their day." Another shrug. "Or we do it the other way. Your call." Marjorie Caldwell had unfolded her arms. She was gripping the top rail of her garden fence now, her knuckles pale against the wood, watching with a focus that had left behind all ambiguity about what she was seeing. Calvin looked at Vance Pruitt with the steady, undeceived eyes of a man who has just made a decision that will outlast both of them, and the decision was not one more step back, not 1 inch of yielded ground. "You are making a mistake," Calvin said. "I am telling you that clearly as a citizen and a homeowner. You are going to want to remember this moment." "I've heard that one before," Pruitt said, and turned to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7 Foxtrot. I'm at the address on Maplewood Court, Cedarwood Heights. I have an uncooperative male subject refusing to identify himself, requesting a backup unit." He released the mic and looked at Calvin with an expression that was almost pleased. "You had your chance." Calvin spoke clearly and deliberately, projecting his voice at the level he had used in courtrooms and precinct briefings for decades. Not shouting, but carrying, ensuring that the words reached every recording device and every witness on the street. "I am not resisting. I have not committed any crime. I am a resident of this property. I have been entirely cooperative within the lawful bounds of what I am required to provide. I am formally requesting a supervisor be dispatched to this location. This is an unlawful stop." Pruitt took a step forward and grabbed Calvin's left arm. The grip was rough and purposeful. The grip of a man who has made physical contact with citizens in this way before and who has faced no lasting consequence for it. He attempted to turn Calvin toward the car to initiate the compliance position, and Calvin did not swing and did not shove and did not run. He planted his feet. He let his body become what it was, solid and trained, standing entirely still and making no threatening movement of any kind, simply refusing to be repositioned by a man with no lawful basis for doing so. "Stop resisting," Pruitt said, his voice rising. "I am standing perfectly still," Calvin said. Pruitt's grip tightened. His other hand went to his belt and produced his baton, an extendable steel rod that caught the morning sun as he extended it. The sound of the baton snapping open was loud and sharp in the quiet of the cul-de-sac. Sawyer Tillman stopped breathing across the street. Marjorie Caldwell made a sound that was not quite a word. The raised baton was the line. Not for Calvin's sake. He had been cataloging this encounter with the professional detachment of a man gathering evidence for a case he intended to win, and he had not lost that detachment for a single moment. The raised baton was the line because of Loretta, who had moved to the front window, and whose silhouette he could see in the glass, and because of every person on the street who was watching, and because Pruitt had a baton in the air in a residential driveway aimed at a man who had not done anything except own a car and a house in the wrong zip code, according to Officer Vance Pruitt's specific brand of wrong. Calvin made no movement toward the officer. He did not need to. "Put the baton down, Officer Pruitt," Calvin said, and the quality of his voice had changed. Not louder, not harsher, but carrying a weight it had not carried before, the weight of rank, of years, of an authority that does not require volume or a raised weapon to assert itself. A command voice. The voice that had ordered surveillance operations and directed homicide scenes and delivered difficult news to victims' families across decades. "Lower it, now!" Pruitt hesitated. The hesitation lasted some seconds, and it was in the long accounting of the morning everything. The hesitation cracked something open in the driveway. Pruitt heard something in Calvin's voice that his body understood, before his mind did a register of authority that was not performed, not manufactured, not the voice of a civilian asserting his rights, but the voice of someone who had given commands in situations where the stakes of being ignored were significantly higher than this one. His hand tightened on the baton but didn't drop it, and his feet shifted that small, involuntary backward step the body makes when it begins to reassess a threat calculation it thought it had right. "You don't give orders here," Pruitt said, but it came out smaller than he intended. "Lower the baton," Calvin said again, "and then you are going to stand still. You are going to watch what I do next, and you are going to look at what I produce. That is all I am asking you to do. Keep your hands visible. I am reaching into my back pocket," Calvin said. His voice was absolutely steady. His hands moved with the deliberate choreography of a man who has performed this action in situations where a mistake in pace or angle could end badly, who has communicated not a threat to armed and frightened people through the precise language of slow and visible movement. "You are going to watch me do this." Pruitt's hand was shaking slightly. The morning had not gone how it was supposed to go, and somewhere below his manufactured certainty, a current of genuine unease had started running, though he couldn't yet name what he was uneasy about. The man in front of him had not behaved like any civilian Pruitt had ever encountered. He had not flinched, not raised his voice, not run, not begged, not produced the vocabulary of a man who was afraid. He had used legal terminology with casual precision. He had given commands in a voice that seemed to expect obedience. He had been through the entire encounter in some fundamental and unshakable way, entirely in control of himself. Pruitt's uncertainty was not wisdom. It was a predator's instinct registering that something about the prey wasn't right. Calvin's right hand moved to his back pocket, visible the entire way, and produced a worn leather badge wallet. The leather soft and dark with use, the edges rounded by years of pocket and hand. He held it in front of him at chest height. He did not open it immediately. He held it for some seconds, long enough for Pruitt to look at it, to register what it was, before he could see what was inside it, to experience the specific pause of a man standing at a door he hadn't expected to find. Then Calvin's wrist turned and the wallet opened. The morning sun was at the precise angle that made the gold unavoidable. It caught the shield directly, not glinting off it the way cheap metal glints, but absorbing the light and giving it back with a deep, rich, unhurried intensity of something substantial. Something earned over a very long time and at a very specific cost. The heavy engraved Detective Sergeant's shield of the Garland City Police Department, Major Crimes Division, not a patrolman's silver disc. Something older and denser and entirely different in the way that it was different. Beside it in the identification window, the department issued photo ID Calvin, Detective Sergeant Major Crimes Division, star number. The photograph showed a man in full dress blues, a collar full of commendation citations, looking out at the camera and at anyone examining this credential with the composed authority of someone who has been in rooms far more serious than a driveway. It was the same face standing in front of Pruitt right now in paint-splattered work pants in a faded Howard University shirt. Pruitt's brain performed the specific agonizing work of receiving information that contradicts a foundational assumption. He looked at the gold shield. He looked at the ID photograph. He looked at the work pants. He looked back at the badge. His mouth opened. No sound came. The color moved out of his face from the temples downward, a tide going out fast and total, leaving something gray and slack in its place. The specific pallor that arrives when the blood finds other priorities. His jaw continued moving, opening and closing with the automatic disconnected quality of a machine that hasn't received the signal to stop. His eyes moved from the badge to the work pants and back to the badge and back to the face, performing the loop over and over as though a sufficient number of repetitions might produce a different result. Then his hand dropped from the baton, not a controlled movement, not a decision. The arm simply fell the way a load falls when you stop holding it up, the muscles going slack because whatever signal had been keeping them taut had just been interrupted at the source. The baton swung limply against his leg, and then he released it entirely, and the steel rod hit the concrete of Calvin's driveway with a sound that seemed to echo for longer than physics should have allowed. A sound that rang through the cul-de-sac and reached Marjorie Caldwell at her fence and Sawyer Tillman across the street and settled into the quiet morning air like the final word in a very long argument. Pruitt stared at the badge. He stared at it the way a man stares at something that has just restructured the architecture of the next years of his life. "Sergeant," he finally said. The word came out fractured, carrying the sound of something irreversible, the sound of a door closing behind you and understanding, for the first time, that there is no handle on the inside. I didn't." "You didn't what?" Calvin said. His voice had returned to the calm level register of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive, not with triumph, but with the absolute quiet weight of authority applied to a situation it had been waiting patiently to correct. "You didn't realize black men own homes in Cedarwood Heights. You didn't realize we restore classic cars, work on them ourselves, spend a morning doing something ordinary in the house we earned." He let each question stand for a moment before the next. "Or did you simply not care because you believed you could walk into a man's driveway and bully him for what you decided he was when you looked at him?" Pruitt's mouth moved again. Nothing. Two police cruisers rounded the bend of Maplewood Court simultaneously, their engines preceded by a brief burst of siren killed as they turned onto the residential street. Doors swinging open, boot heels on asphalt. Sergeant Vivian Cole emerged from the first cruiser, a veteran with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that had seen enough mornings to know immediately what kind this was. She walked across the driveway with the quick assessing step of a senior officer reading a scene, and her eyes moved from Pruitt's pale baton, dropped in the posture of a man expecting to be struck to the badge wallet in Calvin's hand, and she stopped as if she had walked into a wall she hadn't seen. "Sergeant Ramsey." She came to full attention, not the formal military kind, the instinctive kind, the kind a career officer produces when faced with someone whose rank and reputation command it without asking. "Sir," from the second cruiser, Officer Harlan Webb, who had sat in more of Calvin's briefings than he could count, climbed out, took in the scene in a single sweep, and stood at attention beside his vehicle without being told to. Two officers, both standing at attention, for the man in the work pants. Pruitt looked at Cole. He looked at Webb. He looked at Calvin. He looked at the department ID photograph one more time, and in the specific quality of his silence. In that moment, the silence of a man watching every exit close simultaneously, the entire time of what he had been and what he had done and what he had believed he could continue to do, collapsed into the space of a single irreversible second. Then on Pruitt's own radio, the radio through which he had called for backup moments ago, the dispatcher's voice crackled out across the driveway. "Unit 7 Foxtrot copy. Also, Sergeant Ramsey, are you on scene at Maplewood Court?" The department's own system. Addressing Calvin by rank over Pruitt's radio, in Pruitt's driveway, in front of the backup Pruitt had called for himself. Marjorie Caldwell, at her fence, slowly unclenched her hands from the rail. Across the street, Sawyer Tillman lowered his phone. From the front door of the house, Loretta Ramsey stood on the porch and watched her husband. Morning sun in his paint-splattered work pants and his faded Howard University shirt, and her expression carried everything that decades of marriage had made between them, compressed into a single look that required no words and crossed the yard without effort. Calvin closed the badge wallet. He slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Vance Pruitt one last time with the calm, undeceived gaze of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been moving toward for a long time. Then he picked up his chamois cloth from the roof of the Chevelle and finished the front bumper. Sergeant Vivian Cole had been a police officer for long enough to have developed an efficient internal vocabulary for the different categories of situations she encountered. There were situations that were what they appeared to be. There were situations that were worse than they appeared to be. And there were situations that, when you arrived at them, had already resolved themselves in a way that left you with a very specific and uncomfortable administrative function. This was the third kind. She approached Pruitt with the professional briskness of a woman who had no interest in extending this scene any longer than necessary. "Officer Pruitt, your weapon, your badge, and your radio, please." She produced an evidence bag from her belt, holding it open with the quiet procedural neutrality of a person who has been in enough of these moments to know that commentary is not useful. Pruitt looked at the bag. He looked at Calvin. He looked at Cole. He appeared for a moment to be calculating something, the angles of it, the possible exits, the likelihood that there was still a version of this morning that ended differently. Whatever calculation he ran, it returned nothing useful. He unclipped his radio, first setting it into the bag with stiffness in his fingers that was either cold or something else. His badge came next, the Silver Shield Standard Patrol issue standard in every way that Calvin's was not. He placed it in the bag without ceremony. Then the duty weapon, which Cole accepted through secondary protocol, noting the make and serial number on a small card. "Suspension is effective immediately," Calvin said. He stood at the side of his driveway with the chamois cloth in one hand and the authority of his rank in the other, and both were equally present. "You are not to contact fellow officers about the events of this morning. You are not to access departmental systems, files, or communications. If union representation contacts you, you are free to speak with them. If anyone else from the department contacts you, refer them to internal affairs." He paused, giving Pruitt the specific amount of time it takes for instructions to move from the ears to the place in the brain where they register as real. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Pruitt said. The word was barely audible. Calvin turned and looked at his house. Loretta had come out to the porch barefoot on the painted boards, her housecoat wrapped around her. She was holding her coffee cup in both hands and looking at him from across the yard with an expression that asked a specific question without words. And Calvin met it with the specific answer that requires no words either. A slow nod, a slight downward tilt of the chin. He watched her shoulders drop, and he understood exactly what that meant, and it meant everything. Marjorie Caldwell spoke from her fence with the clear, caring voice of a woman who taught for decades and never once had to raise it to be heard. "We all saw it, Calvin. Every last bit of it. The whole street." She wasn't offering testimony, not yet. She was offering something deeper and more immediate. Witness. The specific declaration a community makes when it refuses to pretend it didn't see what it saw. "Thank you, huh?" Calvin said. She nodded. Pruitt was escorted to Cole's cruiser. He walked with the stiff, disconnected gait of someone whose body is performing a movement his mind is not directing. He did not look back at the Chevelle. He looked at the street in front of his feet with the focused, tunneling attention of a man trying very hard to hold himself inside the present moment and not let himself understand what all of it means. The cruiser door closed. Calvin picked up his sponge, dipped it in the bucket of soapy water, and began working on the passenger door of the Chevelle. The Percy Sledge record had ended. From inside the garage, something new was playing. Sam Cooke, "A Change Is Gonna Come," which struck Calvin in the quiet that followed the cruiser's departure as so precisely appropriate to the moment that he almost smiled. He worked the sponge over the door in slow, even circles. The morning settled back into itself. The mockingbirds in Marjorie's oak tree resumed their argument. From somewhere around the bend of the cul-de-sac, the training wheel bicycle was attempting the slope again. Pruitt's apartment was on the west side of Garland that had been constructed with the ambition of budget efficiency and the result of a building that carried its own atmosphere of institutional resignation. Hallways that smelled of carpet cleaner and cooking oil, a parking lot perpetually one space short. He sat on his couch the next morning with his phone in his hand and ran the same calculation he had been running since the previous afternoon in the progressively shifting light of a man who needs a different answer than the one the math keeps producing. He called Curtis Langford. Langford picked up on the second ring with the voice of a man who had already heard. "I know him," Langford said before Pruitt could identify himself. "I got a call from Vivian Cole." Pruitt told him everything. He had rehearsed it overnight, and it came out with the smoothness of a narrative that has been revised several times. He had received an informal community concern flagged to his sector. He had been conducting a welfare check when the occupant became uncooperative and refused lawful requests. The subject had physically resisted when Pruitt attempted a standard compliance maneuver. Pruitt had deployed his baton in the interest of officer safety. The subject had then produced a police credential. He said this last part with the particular neutrality of a man trying to present it as an incidental detail rather than the load-bearing element of the entire story. Silence on the other end. "Kyle," Langford said, "did you call the stop into dispatch before you activated your lights?" A pause. "I was going to call it in after I made contact." Another silence, longer. "Did you turn on your body camera before you got out of the cruiser?" It was already on from the prior patrol. "Right." Langford exhaled the exhale of a man doing mental accounting in real time. "Here's the situation as I currently understand it. You stopped a detective sergeant from major crimes on his day off on his own property without dispatch notification, without documented probable cause, attempted to detain him, deployed your baton, and did not identify his credential when it was produced. He didn't present the credential until after I know when he presented it. That's not the part I'm concerned about." Langford paused. "Kyle, the body camera was on the whole time." The statement sat between them with the weight of a very large and very immovable object. "I know," Pruitt said, "and the body camera caught everything, I know, including you putting your hand on your holster before he moved." A longer pause. Outside Pruitt's apartment window, a car alarm went off in the parking lot and then stopped. The next morning continued its indifferent progress. "The union files standard grievance procedures in the event of termination," Langford said. "I can do that. I've done it before. But Kyle, I need you to understand something. The prior complaints, I was able to manage those because the documentation was incomplete and the situations were ambiguous. This is not ambiguous. This has a body camera, and based on what Cole is telling me, it may also have civilian footage from a neighbor's security camera." He paused again. "A detective sergeant from major crimes, Kyle. Do you understand what that means for how this gets handled? I didn't know who he was." "I understand that." Another exhale. "Get some rest. Don't talk to anyone from the department until I can assess what we're working with. I'll be in touch." The call ended. Pruitt set the phone on the couch cushion and looked at the television. A football pregame show was running men in suits discussing something with great enthusiasm. He watched it without processing any of it. He told himself with the specific self-deception of a man who needs to sleep that tomorrow would find an angle. Tomorrow always found an angle. The union had resources. The department had procedures. There was always a version of events that could be managed into something survivable. He went to bed almost comfortable with the belief that he would be fine. He did not know that later that night, while he was asleep, Harlan Pitts, a retired contractor who lived directly across the cul-de-sac from the address, had spent the evening reviewing the previous day's footage from the security system installed around his property following a package theft. The camera mounted above his front porch had as a function of its wide-angle lens and his property's elevation a clear and unobstructed view of the entire Maplewood Court cul-de-sac, including the Ramsey driveway. The footage showed in high-definition resolution, with a timestamp overlay, a Garland City Police Department patrol cruiser turning onto Maplewood Court and coming to a slow stop. The officer inside did not exit the vehicle. The footage showed him sitting in the cruiser stationary for some time, watching Calvin Ramsey wash his car. It showed the officer making no radio transmission during that period. It showed the emergency lights activating. It showed the officer exiting the vehicle and walking toward the driveway with his right hand already near his duty belt. Harlan Pitts copied the relevant segment to a flash drive and emailed it to the Garland City Police Department's Civilian Oversight Board with a subject line that read, "Re-incident at Maplewood Court. Complete prior police footage you may need." He CC'd the Internal Affairs Division. Meanwhile, at the same hour in his home office, Calvin Ramsey was at his desk with Pruitt's personnel file on the screen, forwarded by Cole with a quiet note that said, Only thought you'd want to see the full picture. Reading through multiple use of force complaint reports that had each been filed, reviewed, and closed without formal disciplinary action. He read them with the careful, methodical attention he gave to case files. He noted the name that appeared on the closing authorization for all of them. He noted the dates, the demographics of the complainants, the similarity of language in Pruitt's own written accounts of each incident. He picked up his phone and called District Attorney Harlan Webb. Webb picked up. "I expected to hear from you," he said. "Then you've already seen the body camera footage," Calvin said. "It was flagged to my office along with a neighbor's security footage that arrived in the IA inbox." A pause. "Calvin, tell me you want to pursue this properly." "I want to pursue this properly," Calvin said. "All of it, not just that morning. The prior complaints, the authorization chain that closed them, the pattern." A longer pause. When Webb spoke again, his voice had the quality of a prosecutor who has just been handed a case he knows he can win. "I can have a grand jury convened." "Good," Calvin said. He closed the personnel file, turned off the desk lamp, and sat in the dark of his office for a few minutes, listening to the house settle around him. The familiar sound of his home, the specific quiet that belongs to the place a man has built. And then he went to bed. Calvin walked through the glass doors of the Garland City Police Department's main district precinct early one morning, wearing his Class A dress uniform. The brass buttons were polished to mirror finish. His trousers carried a crease that could measure a right angle. The gold detective sergeant's shield on his left breast caught the fluorescent lighting and gave it back with interest. He walked with the measured pace of a man who has been in this building for decades and has no reason to hurry. He moved through the bullpen quickly. On a normal morning, it held the raucous energy of officers arriving for shift change. This morning carried the heavy crackling undercurrent of a place where people are being very careful about what they say out loud. The news of what had happened on Maplewood Court had moved through the department with the velocity of information that carries genuine stakes. Officers who were crossing the bullpen slowed and nodded the nod of someone who has chosen their side and wants that choice to be visible. Calvin walked through without pausing, headed toward the basement internal affairs offices. He gave his statement to Detective Tara Voss in a conference room, precise, chronological, stripped of editorial commentary. He described each exchange, each of Pruitt's actions, each of his own responses in the flat, detailed language of an experienced investigator narrating a case to a colleague. He did not embellish. He did not characterize Pruitt beyond what the record required. He simply described what had happened. Downstairs, the trap was closing. Voss was compact with dark hair cut close to her skull and eyes that operated on an independent evaluation system. They continued assessing while her face remained professionally neutral. She thought about cases the way accountants think about numbers. Every figure has a source. Every source can be verified. And the gap between the claim figure and the actual figure is always more interesting than either alone. Pruitt sat across from her with Langford to his left. He looked like a man who had convinced himself the night before that the math was survivable and was now in the fluorescent light beginning to revise that assessment. Voss opened her laptop without preamble. "Officer Pruitt," she said, "your written statement characterizes the subject as physically resistive and states your baton deployment was in response to an aggressive movement toward you." She looked at him with the specific quality of patience that comes from having no interest in the answer being what she expects. "I'd like to walk through the body camera footage alongside that statement." The footage played. It showed everything. Calvin's hands consistently visible, consistently still throughout every exchange. The license plate returned clean, matching the Ramsey address, and Pruitt's decision to continue regardless. The moment Pruitt moved between Calvin and his own front door. Each exchange in crystal clear audio that the body camera's directional microphone had captured with the impartiality of a machine that has no stake in the outcome. The holster unsnap, the baton deployment, Calvin standing perfectly still through all of it. Voice measured and precise hands never once moving toward Pruitt. When the video reached the badge reveal and the sound of the baton hitting the concrete, Pruitt looked away from the screen. Voss paused the footage. "Your written statement indicates you deployed your baton because the subject made a sudden aggressive movement toward me," she said. "The footage shows the subject standing still with his hands at his sides at the time of baton deployment." She looked at him. "Would you like to revise that?" Pruitt opened his mouth. Langford put a hand on his arm. Kyle. The voice had none of the comfortable warmth that usually carried when managing someone's problem. It had a careful, neutral quality. The voice of a man choosing words with the awareness that words are being chosen. Don't. Voss stepped out of the room to allow them a moment. The door closed. In the silence that followed, Langford looked at Vance Pruitt with the expression of a man who has done this job for a long time and has arrived at a specific and unambiguous conclusion. The body camera footage is what it is, Langford said. I've reviewed it. I cannot characterize it as ambiguous because it isn't. Your written statement contradicts it in specific points. He paused. There is also an additional footage source, a neighbor's security camera that captured you stationary in your cruiser for some time before you activated your lights. No dispatch call, no radio contact. Pruitt stared at the table. Langford continued. The union files standard grievance procedures in the event of termination. I am obligated to tell you that. A pause that carried the weight of what was coming. I am also obligated to tell you that based on the material currently in Voss's file, a grievance will not produce a different outcome. It will extend the timeline. It will not change the destination. He collected his folder, straightened his tie, and stood. I'd advise you to consult a criminal defense attorney, he said, before the end of this week. He knocked twice on the door and Voss returned. Langford walked out without looking back at the man he had protected multiple times before and would not be protecting again. The formal hearing convened later in the department's administrative conference room on an upper floor, a room designed for the specific business of institutional consequence, with its long mahogany table and the city seal on the wall, and the particular quality of light that comes through institutional blinds on a weekday afternoon. Chief of Police Lena Hargrove sat at the head of the table, flanked by Deputy Chief Arnold Torres and Civilian Oversight Board Representative Elaine Cross, a retired federal judge. At the far end sat Vance Pruitt and his attorney, Craig Donner, who had spent time constructing an argument that the incident on Maplewood Court represented an overzealous but good-faith exercise of patrol discretion, a phrase that, as Donner had privately concluded while reviewing the body camera footage, had the structural integrity of a dam built from good intentions. District Attorney Harlan Webb sat along the sidewall as an observer. His presence communicated everything it was intended to communicate. Calvin sat on the right side of the table in dress uniform, no papers in front of him, no notes. He had been sitting at tables like this for decades and had long since stopped needing to perform the quality of his attention. Donner presented his argument, smooth delivery, professional framing. At no point during those minutes did Chief Hargrove turn to look at him. She was reading the body camera transcript with the steady attention of someone who has formed a view and is looking for anything that would revise it. She found nothing that revised it. Sergeant Ramsey, she said, the board recognizes you. Calvin stood. I've written statements before, he said. I've written them about things I've investigated. I've never written one about something that happened to me. So I'm going to do something different this morning. He looked around the table at Hargrove, at Torres, at Cross, and then at Pruitt directly. I'm going to tell you what the morning felt like, he told them. The Chevelle, the morning earned by decades of work, the reflex, that feeling that every black man of his generation in this country learns before long division, when the patrol cruiser slowed at the entrance to his cul-de-sac. He described each exchange with Pruitt with the precision of a trained investigator and the authority of a man speaking about what was done to his own body in front of his own home. And then he came to the part that mattered most. When he looked toward my house, Calvin said, and his voice carried something heavier in it than it had been carrying, and told me that anyone inside could be subject to emergency removal. I want to be honest about what I felt. I felt what every man feels when a threat is made against the people he is responsible for. I felt the specific fear that has nothing to do with yourself and everything to do with what you have built and who you have built it with. He paused. He looked at Pruitt. And then I felt something else. I felt the weight of prior complaints that were filed and dismissed. I felt the weight of the people who filed them and were told by one mechanism or another that the system would not listen. This is not a one-morning problem. This is years of the same behavior protected by the same structural accommodations, finally expressing itself in a location where the accommodation had run out. He looked at Hargrove directly. I am not asking for Officer Pruitt's termination because he insulted me, Calvin said, his voice dropping to the register of an instrument that does not need amplification to be heard. I am demanding it because he is a danger to the citizens of this city, and I am asking that the full authorization chain for those prior dismissed complaints be examined, not just the branch, the root. He sat down. The silence that followed lasted some seconds, which is a very long time in a room full of people with things they could say. Chief Hargrove did not deliberate. Officer Vance Pruitt, she said, effective immediately, your employment with the Garland City Police Department is terminated for cause. I am simultaneously forwarding a formal request to the State Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission for permanent decertification. You will never wear a badge in this state. She looked at him without particular emotion. The grounds are documented racial profiling, unlawful detention, falsification of incident report details, and conduct unbecoming. D.A. Webb leaned forward from his chair along the wall. Mr. Pruitt, the district attorney's office has completed its preliminary criminal review. A grand jury convenes soon. I would encourage you to spend the next days in close consultation with your attorney. Donner put a hand on Pruitt's arm. Professional management, not comfort. As Pruitt was escorted from the building, he walked down the corridor with the gait of a man whose body is performing a movement his mind is not directing. At the end of the corridor, he pushed through the glass door and stepped into an afternoon that was entirely indifferent to his presence within it. Calvin remained seated for a moment after the room began to clear. Hargrove waited. The prior complaints, Calvin said. The closing authorizations. Voss has already flagged them, Hargrove said. The board will review the full chain. She paused. The Oversight Commission chair position, the civilian board is asking. Calvin considered this. He thought about the people whose complaints had been dismissed, whose names he had read, who had attempted to use the available mechanism for addressing what had happened to them, and had been told by the structure that Langford administered that their experience was insufficient for action. Tell the board yes, he said. The Garland County Courthouse, by the morning that State versus Pruitt was scheduled to begin jury selection, had acquired the particular atmosphere of a civic event that has outgrown its original dimensions. Satellite trucks occupied most of the plaza. Camera positions from national news organizations flanked the wide limestone steps. A documentary crew that had been following the case had established a position near the main entrance that the courthouse's security staff had negotiated down to a single stationary camera, an arrangement that satisfied no one and served everyone adequately. Inside courtroom, Vance Pruitt sat at the defense table and looked nothing like the man who had patrolled Maplewood Court. He had lost weight since the driveway. His face had a drawn quality. The suit Craig Donner had advised him to purchase for the trial, charcoal conservative communicating something other than what his patrol uniform had communicated, did its technical job. What it could not do was restore the posture. The posture was simply gone. The jaw that had looked engineered for argument now sat loose on his face with the particular slack quality of a feature that has lost its primary function. His eyes, which in his patrol days had moved through environments with the scanning confidence of a man convinced of his welcome, now tracked the courtroom with the careful reactive movement of someone assessing risk rather than asserting authority. Beside him, Craig Donner had his trial materials organized in his standard color-coded system. He had studied the available footage more than enough times. He had concluded with the professional self-assessment of a defense attorney who has learned to be honest with himself in private, if nowhere else, that the argument was solid enough to produce at minimum a hung jury on the felony assault charge. The key variable was Calvin Ramsey. Donner's strategy rested entirely on reframing, not what had happened. The footage was the footage, but what it meant. An off-duty officer, plainclothes declining to identify himself, physically resisting when a patrol officer attempted a compliance maneuver, a superior officer setting up a junior one, deliberately concealing his rank to produce a disciplinary outcome. A man trying to do a job in circumstances that were not what they appeared. District Attorney Harlan Webb opened for the state with the brisk, factual confidence of a man who does not feel the need to make a case seem more than it is because it is already everything. No emotional language, no rhetorical architecture, just the sequence of documented events, the footage, and the prior dismissed complaints admitted as pattern evidence over Donner's objections by Judge Naomi Hargrove, a woman with the precise judicial demeanor of someone who has heard a great deal of argument in her career and is not impressed by volume. The footage played for the jury without commentary. The men and women watched the body camera footage with the concentrated attention of people who are forming opinions and are aware that the opinions they form here will have consequences. They watched Calvin's hands consistently visible, consistently still. They heard each exchange. They heard the welfare check threat, and jurors made small involuntary movements in their seats, the kind of physical response that bodies make when they process something their minds identify as genuinely wrong. Webb let the footage finish. He let the silence stand. Then he began. Across the courtroom, Calvin sat in his dress uniform with Loretta beside him on the gallery bench, her hand in his. He watched the footage play with the specific, removed attention of a detective reviewing case evidence, focused, analytical. The warmth of Loretta's hand was steady against his palm. Calvin was called to the stand on the second day of the trial. He walked from the gallery to the witness stand with the unhurried, contained pace that was simply how he moved through spaces, dressed in the same Class A uniform he had worn to every institutional proceeding since the morning in the driveway. And he swore the oath with the steady, caring voice that had delivered briefings and testimony and scene assessments across decades. He sat with the posture of a man who has been in chairs like this before and has always told the truth in them and has never found the experience particularly frightening. Under Webb's direct examination, Calvin narrated the events of the morning with the precision and objectivity of a detective describing an investigation to a review panel. He did not embellish. He did not editorialize. He presented the facts in their sequence, each one documented by evidence already in the record, and he described his own decisions. The decision not to immediately identify himself, the decision to remain still, the decision to maintain calm with the same matter-of-fact clarity he applied to everything else. "Sergeant Ramsey," Webb said toward the end of the direct examination, "you've described maintaining significant composure throughout a confrontation that involved an officer pointing a weapon at you, attempting to physically restrain you, and threatening to have your wife removed from your home. Why didn't you simply identify yourself as a police officer?" Calvin considered the question for a moment. "Because I am a citizen first," he said. "I have been a citizen of this city my entire life. I was a citizen before I was a police officer, and I will be one long after. A citizen should not need a badge in their back pocket to be treated with basic dignity on their own property on a morning." He paused. "And I chose to wait because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. I know the difference between an officer who makes an error and an officer who operates with the sustained conviction that certain people do not require the protections that other people receive automatically." Officer Pruitt was not confused. He was not uncertain. He made a series of deliberate choices from the moment he turned onto my street without calling dispatch to the moment he raised his baton, and every one of those choices was made with the confidence of a man who had made them before without consequence. The courtroom was very quiet. Webb nodded and sat down. Craig Donner approached the podium for cross-examination with the particular energy of a man who has spent time preparing for this specific moment. His strategy not to destroy Calvin's credibility, that was not achievable, but to introduce the possibility that the situation was more complicated than the state was representing. That Calvin's deliberate concealment of his identity had created conditions that produced the outcome. "Sergeant Ramsey," Donner began, "you are a decorated officer, extensive training in defensive tactics, de-escalation, suspect compliance, correct?" "That's correct." "You are in fact a certified defensive tactics instructor for the entire district." "I am." "So when a patrol officer approaches a large, physically imposing man who is declining to provide identification and refusing compliance directives, isn't it reasonable that the officer might feel genuine apprehension, might feel his safety was at risk?" Calvin looked at Donner with the expression of a man who can see exactly where the trail is going and is not going to pretend he can't. "I was declining to provide identification. I was not legally required to provide," Calvin said. "Lawful compliance directives must be lawful. Directives based on manufactured probable cause are not. The training you're describing would clarify that distinction for any officer with adequate preparation." Donner adjusted his approach. "Sergeant, You intentionally concealed your police identity during the entire confrontation. You made a decision to withhold it, which had the effect of prolonging the encounter and escalating the risk to both parties. Officer Pruitt created every escalation, Calvin said. My decisions were responses to his. I escalated nothing. I threatened no one. I touched no one. My decision to wait was the same decision that anyone who does not have a badge to produce makes in every one of these encounters. They wait and they hope, and they try to survive the interaction without being harmed. Donner tried several more angles. He attempted to frame Calvin's physical presence as inherently intimidating. He suggested that Calvin's legal knowledge was a form of deliberate provocation. He attempted to paint the situation as one that Calvin, with his training and rank, could have diffused at any moment and chose not to for personal reasons. Calvin answered each question with the same measured factual clarity. He did not get angry. He did not get flustered. He did not retreat behind official language when plain language served better. He sat in the witness chair and told the truth in the specific, precise way of a man who has told the truth in difficult circumstances many times before and has found that the truth delivered with sufficient clarity and patience tends to stand up. By the time Donner sat down, he looked like a man who had been climbing a hill and had arrived at the top to find there was another hill. Calvin looked like a man who could have continued. He stepped down from the stand, walked back through the well of the court, and took his seat beside Loretta. She leaned very slightly against his shoulder for a fraction of a second that no one else in the courtroom would have noticed. He noticed. Donner made his desperation visible. The evidence was not going well. The body camera footage had been played. The pit's doorbell footage had been authenticated and admitted, and the jury had watched in high resolution. A Garland City police officer sit in his cruiser for some time, observing a man wash a car before activating his emergency lights without radio contact. The prior dismissed complaints had come in as pattern evidence through the testimony of each complainant, men from different parts of the city describing encounters with Pruitt over some years that bore the structural fingerprint of the encounter on Maplewood Court. Each of them had filed complaints. Each had been dismissed. Each now sat in the gallery and watched the proceedings with the particular attention of people for whom this trial was about something larger than the formal charges. Donner had one card left. He called Vance Pruitt to the stand. Pruitt took the oath with a trembling hand. He sat in the witness chair with the posture of a man carrying something very heavy. Under Donner's direct examination, he wept. He described the morning as a patrol officer trying to do his job in an unfamiliar district. He described his fear. Genuine, he said, his voice breaking, when a large man refused his commands. He described the baton deployment as an act not of aggression, but of desperation. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the jury, and then he said something that hadn't been in any prior statement. Right before the camera picked up the audio clearly, Pruitt said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "He leaned toward me and he told me. He said he was going to take my gun." The statement landed in the courtroom the way unexpected things land in enclosed spaces, a pulse of changed air, a collective micro-movement, a shifting of weight in chairs. Donner held the moment with the careful neutrality of a man watching the element he needed begin to work. Jurors were frowning, not with rejection, with consideration. The specific frown of people genuinely uncertain about something they thought they were certain about. On the gallery bench, Calvin watched Pruitt make the claim with the quiet, still attention of a man watching a trap close around someone who built it themselves. Harlan Webb stood for cross-examination with the serene composure of a man who has been waiting for exactly this. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, walking slowly toward the center of the floor, "you claim you were frightened. You claim you were just a patrol officer in an unfamiliar area doing his job, overwhelmed by a situation that got away from him." He paused. "The state calls a rebuttal witness." He turned toward the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, the state calls Officer Kendra Cole." Vance Pruitt's face drained of whatever little color it had retained. He gripped the armrest of the witness chair. His knuckles went white. Kendra Cole was a patrol officer and walked down the aisle of the courtroom with the particular careful composure of someone who has been rehearsing steadiness and intends to maintain it. She took the oath. She sat down. She looked at a point slightly above and between both tables, which was where she would continue looking. Webb approached calmly. Officer Cole, you and the defendant served together at the East Side Precinct before his transfer to the Cedarwood Heights sector, correct? Yes, sir. Could you describe for the jury a specific conversation you had with Officer Pruitt sometime before the incident on Maplewood Court? Cole took a breath. She had asked herself in the time since the incident many times whether she should have recorded the conversation, whether doing so without consent was an invasion, whether the content justified the method. She had arrived through that process at a clear answer. The content justified it entirely, and if anything, she had waited too long to act on what the recording contained. I was in the precinct locker room, she said. Officer Pruitt was talking about his transfer. He said the Cedarwood Heights sector was too quiet. He said he was bored. He said he was going to make a name for himself so he could get into a specialized unit. He said rich neighborhoods get complacent. That was the word he used, and that he was going to start, and I'm quoting him here, shaking the trees over there to see what fell out. A murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Hargrove's gavel made a single quiet tap. Did he say anything else, Fuse? Webb asked. Cole paused. Not hesitation, the pause of a person who is about to say something specific and wants to say it exactly right. He said he knew exactly what kind of people to look for, she said. He used a racial slur. He said those people didn't belong in houses like that, and that all he needed was one excuse, to his exact words, to hook one up and make a headline for himself. The murmur in the gallery became something larger. Judge Hargrove's gavel came down with authority, and the room returned to an effortful silence. Craig Donner was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is inadmissible hearsay. There is no corroboration for this testimony. No documentation. Your Honor, Webb said, reaching into the file folder on his table without any particular hurry, producing a small silver personal audio recorder in a sealed evidence bag. The statement is not hearsay. Because Officer Cole, disturbed by what she heard, had the presence of mind to press record on her personal device when Officer Pruitt began speaking. The state has a complete audio recording of the conversation authenticated by the State Crime Laboratory, verified against voice print analysis of known samples of Officer Pruitt's recorded speech from his department-issued body camera, and ready for the jury's consideration. The silence that followed was the silence of a courtroom in which every person present understands that something has just been decided. Donner sat down, not slowly, not with any visible performance of defeat, but with the specific quiet deflation of a man who has just finished a race and knows the time. The recording played through the courtroom's audio system. It captured what Cole had described with the clarity of a device held in a pocket at close range, ambient noise, the sounds of a locker room, and Vance Pruitt's voice in the uncensored, comfortable tone of a man speaking to someone he believes shares his worldview, saying things that he had never said in any official capacity because the official capacity required a different performance. The jury listened. The courtroom was absolutely still. When the recording ended, Pruitt had both hands flat against the armrests of the witness chair. His face was angled downward. The tears that had come during Donner's direct examination had dried, and what remained in their place was not grief and was not anger, but was the specific hollow expression of a man watching the last credible account of himself collapse in real time. The last lie, the last exit, all of it in seconds of his own voice. He had thought he was untouchable. He had been wrong about that since the day he met Curtis Langford, who had convinced him that protection was the same thing as impunity, and who had walked out of an internal affairs room without looking back. No redirect, Your Honor, Donner said. He was not even pretending anymore. The jury deliberated for some time. When the foreperson, a logistics manager named Carol Reyes, who had been quiet through the entire process and had demonstrated in the deliberation room a quality of analytical precision that the other jurors had aligned themselves around, read the verdict. Her voice was clear and carried no particular emotion, which is the way verdict readings are supposed to go and frequently don't. On the count of aggravated assault under color of authority, the jury finds the defendant Vance Pruitt guilty. Pruitt closed his eyes. On the count of false imprisonment, guilty. On the count of felony civil rights deprivation, guilty. The gallery produced a sound that was not a cheer and was not crying, and was something in the difficult necessary space between them. Judge Hargrove brought her gavel down once, not harshly. She ordered the jury to step out. She looked at Pruitt for a long moment, When she spoke, it was without the neutral judicial register that the sentencing phase would require, and without any particular effort to disguise the absence. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "in my time on this bench, I have presided over cases involving men who did terrible things for comprehensible reasons. Poverty, desperation, the specific damage that difficult lives create. I have rarely presided over a case in which the available evidence suggests that the harm caused was a product of sustained, deliberate, institutionally protected choice." She placed her pen on the bench. "You were trusted with the most significant responsibility that a democratic society confers on its agents, the discretionary use of force on behalf of the law. You treated that trust as a license." She paused. "Sentencing soon. I suggest you use the time to arrive at something genuine about what you did." She rose. The courtroom rose with her. Calvin and Loretta walked out through the side gallery exit. They emerged into the afternoon. The light thinner, the shadows longer. The quality of the air entirely different from the morning that had started all of this. Loretta took his arm. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I feel like something that was supposed to happen finally happened," he said. "And I feel like there is a lot of work left before it matters the way it needs to." She squeezed his arm. "Then let's go home," she said. Sometime later, on a morning with a thin rain falling on the courthouse steps, Judge Naomi Hargrove sentenced Vance Pruitt to years in the state penitentiary. No plea reduction, no early parole consideration before the mandatory minimum. The restitution order for the prior complainants was filed simultaneously in the civil division. Permanent decertification from law enforcement in any state had been finalized. As the marshals placed cuffs on Pruitt's wrists and turned him toward the holding door, he looked back across the courtroom one final time with the searching look of a man who needs to locate something but cannot identify what he's looking for. Calvin met his eyes. He gave him nothing. Not triumph, not pity, not the performance of either. Just the steady, undeceived gaze of a man who has been in this business long enough to understand that consequence is not justice's emotion, it is justice's arithmetic. The necessary accounting of a debt that had accumulated for a long time and was now finally being settled. The door closed. In the back of the gallery, Curtis Langford rose from his seat and walked toward the exit with the studied neutrality of a man who is aware that his own reckoning is pending and who has decided that the best available response is to move through it at his own pace. The Oversight Board's inquiry into his role in the prior dismissed complaints had been open, handled by Tara Voss, who brought to it the same forensic precision she brought to everything. Langford left the courthouse into the thin rain and was gone. Vance Pruitt was processed into the state correctional facility in the evening in a receiving intake building that smelled of industrial disinfectant and the layered institutional odor of bleach failing to cover everything beneath it. He had ridden the transport bus for hours in the specific discomfort of steel restraints on his wrists and ankles, chained to the seat and watching the late autumn landscape through scratched polycarbonate. He had tried to hold himself inside the boundaries of the immediate moment because the larger architecture of what was coming was not yet manageable to look at directly. The intake process was methodical and indifferent. He was stripped of the transport clothes and issued the facility's standard uniform, orange cotton rough at the seams, laundered so many times that the color had faded at the edges to something almost yellow at the hem. He was photographed, fingerprinted, assessed by a nurse who asked questions in a tone that was efficient without being unkind, and assigned to a housing unit. Because of his prior law enforcement status, he was placed in a protective custody unit for his physical safety. The corrections officer who walked him to his cell explained this with the flat professionalism of a man for whom this conversation happened regularly. The protective custody unit was not dangerous. It was also not a sanctuary. It was a tomb. His cell was a concrete box. A steel platform served as a bed with a mattress that had been designed to the minimum standard required to be called one. A stainless steel toilet and sink unit occupied the far corner. A narrow window set high in the concrete wall admitted a strip of sky that changed color with the time of day and served as the room's only connection to the world outside the building. The door closed behind him with the specific mechanical certainty of a door designed to stay closed. In protective custody, he had 1 hour per day outside the cell, the rest inside it. In the first days, he tried to think about the legal angles, the appeal, the contestable audio recording. He held on to these thoughts the way a man in water holds onto the nearest floating thing, not because the thing is sufficient, but because holding it uses energy that would otherwise be occupied by the alternative. But the cell had a way of dissolving the narratives you brought into it. He was not a patrol officer here. He was a number printed on the back of a faded orange shirt. The complete removal of every identity that had been performing the work of making him feel entitled to what he had done arrived with a completeness that was genuinely difficult to withstand. In the long hours of the cell, Vance Pruitt was forced into the specific confrontation that the driveway, the precinct, the courtroom, and the transport bus had each in their own way been delaying. A direct encounter with himself without the performance of authority to stand between him and what he actually was. He replayed the driveway compulsively. He saw Calvin's hands always visible. He heard Calvin's voice steady and clear and carrying that quality of complete self-possession that he understood now with the clarity of hindsight communicated something he had chosen not to hear. He saw the gold shield opening in the afternoon sun. He saw Cole standing at attention. He saw his baton on the concrete. He had told himself for some years that he was doing a job. The cell had a different teaching. In the single hour he was permitted outside each day, he was walked to a small interior recreation area where a television mounted on the wall ran news and entertainment in rotation. On an afternoon sometime after his arrival, a young corrections officer, broad-shouldered with a particular unhurried authority of someone who does not need to perform power because it simply belongs to him in this building, directed Pruitt to the cleaning supply room to collect a mop and bucket for his assigned corridor shift. "You're on tiles through today," the officer said, not looking up from his clipboard. "Mop closet is at the end of the hall." He handed Pruitt the sheet without ceremony, without recognition, without any of the accommodation that Pruitt had experienced as the natural texture of institutional life. Pruitt took the sheet. He collected the mop. He worked the tiles in the long echoing corridor with the slow mechanical rhythm of someone with no particular relationship to the task and years to complete it. At the far end of the corridor, through a reinforced window looking into the common area, the wall-mounted television was running a local news segment. Pruitt recognized the Garland City Hall conference room on the screen. He recognized the man seated at the head of the table in a gray suit addressing the assembled members of the newly formed Independent Civilian Oversight Commission with the particular unhurried authority of a man who has decided this is the work he intends to do and intends to do it well. Calvin Ramsey, speaking about accountability structures, independent review protocols, citizen reporting channels that did not route through the same department they were reporting on. Pruitt stood at the corridor window and watched before the officer at the other end of the hall called out that he needed to keep moving. He kept moving. He thought about the complainants. Their names were in his memory now in a way they had not been before. Not as cases he had managed, not as files that had been reviewed and closed, but as specific people who had encountered him in the way you encounter something that damages you, who had attempted to use the available mechanism for addressing that damage, and who had been told that their experience was insufficient for action. He thought about them in his cell at night, and the thinking had a quality he didn't have precise vocabulary for. Not guilt exactly, not remorse in the way the word is usually deployed, but a recognition that was colder and more permanent than either. The recognition of what he had actually done and what it had actually cost the people he had done it to. Years is a very long time. He had a great deal of it still to go. The first Saturday morning in late spring arrived with a quality of light that is not quite the same as the light of any other season, cleaner and more direct, carrying the particular promise of warmth without yet delivering the weight of summer heat. Calvin was in his driveway early. He wore the same paint-splattered work pants that had survived garage renovation projects and a grass-staining incident and one ill-fated attempt at hardwood floor refinishing, and which having now also survived a confrontation with a police officer, a termination hearing, a felony trial, and the months that followed, all of them had achieved a kind of threadbare mythology. His Howard University shirt was on its last structural year. The fabric so soft and thin at the shoulders, it was more memory of a shirt than actual textile. His canvas sneakers were the same pair, the right toe still carrying the sapphire green paint stripe. The Chevelle sat on the concrete in the morning light. He had filled the bucket with hot soapy water and soaked the wash mitt and worked the hood first, starting at the center and moving outward in the methodical spiraling pattern that ensured even coverage, the same pattern he had been using for some years. The radio in the open garage was playing Marvin Gaye, "What's Going On?" which had come on mid-album and which Calvin had not chosen specifically, but which, when it registered in his peripheral consciousness as he worked, seemed to be there on the particular terms of things that arrive at the right moment. The neighborhood around him was performing the specific domestic theater of a spring morning. A father 2 houses down was attempting to edge his lawn with the studied concentration of a man who has learned that focus on the immediate task is the best available response to a hedge trimmer. A pair of teenagers on bicycles moved through the cul-de-sac with the unhurried ease of people with nowhere particular to be, and a pleasant morning in which to not be there. From the direction of the Caldwell property, the Mockingbirds were conducting their ongoing argument in the live oak with the cheerful combativeness that Calvin had come to think of as part of the sound of home. He heard footsteps on the sidewalk, the particular rhythm of someone walking with purpose but not urgency, and he registered them without turning because the footsteps were familiar. Marjorie Caldwell moved the way she had always moved, with the upright, grounded pace of a woman whose center of gravity had been settled in the same place for years and was not planning to shift. She appeared at the edge of the driveway holding 2 cups of coffee. No tray, no ceremony, just 2 mugs, one in each hand, brought the way a neighbor brings coffee to a neighbor on a morning. "Morning, Calvin," she said. "Morning, Marjorie." He set the wash mitt on the hood, wiped his hands on his pants, and took the cup she offered. Strong the way she always made it. They stood together at the edge of the driveway in the comfortable, unhurried silence of people who have said a great deal to each other over the years and understand that the present moment does not require filling. After a while, Marjorie said, "I submitted the written statement to the commission about the other stops. The times on this street over the past years before yours. Different officers, different pretexts, same basic situation." She paused. "I should have done it sooner. Each time I thought about it, and I told myself it wasn't going to go anywhere, and I put it off." Calvin looked into his coffee cup. "It's not a small thing," he said, "to put your name on something and send it into a system that hasn't always made people feel heard when they did that." "No," Marjorie said, "but I did it." "Yes, you did, Mao," he said, "and the commission is going to use it. Voss's unit is building the full picture, all the stops in this area. Over the past years, the dispatch records, the complaint histories, what you provided closes a gap in the pattern." Marjorie nodded. She drank her coffee. "Your car looks good," she said. "Thank you, Bim," Calvin said. "Took some work to get back to this." It was true in more ways than the literal one, and they both understood that, and neither of them said so directly because it was the kind of understanding that benefits from being left in the air. The front door opened and Loretta came out onto the porch carrying a plate of cornbread, warm from the smell of it, the particular warm cornmeal smell that had been moving through the open window, and that Calvin had been aware of the way you are aware of things that belong to the texture of your life. She was barefoot on the porch boards in her morning clothes, reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead where they always lived on weekends. She came down the porch steps and across the yard and handed the plate to Marjorie first, and Marjorie received it with the expression of a woman who has been brought cornbread by Loretta Ramsey before and knows exactly what that means. The three of them stood together in the spring morning in the driveway of the house at the end of Maplewood Court. The sun was fully up now, the light clear and direct falling on the midnight green of the Chevelle with an intensity that made the paint look like something you could reach into. The chrome bumpers reflected the three of them in their curved, distorted way, small, rounded versions of Calvin and Loretta and Marjorie, compressed into the convex surface of the metal, standing together in a driveway on a morning that belonged to them. Calvin looked at this car, and then at the street, and then at the neighborhood around him. In its spring presentation, the lawns coming back to green, the oak trees leafed out, the particular quality of a morning that belonged to the people in it. He had declined the lieutenant promotion. He had accepted the Oversight Commission chairmanship and had been at it for some months. He had already identified points in the complaint review process where cases like Pruitt's could have been caught earlier and had submitted formal recommendations that the board was currently reviewing. It was not glamorous work. It produced the slow grinding satisfaction of someone who is making something better by increments, who knows the increments are real even when they are not visible, who has decided that this particular work is worth doing because the alternative is to leave the structure as it was and the structure, as it was, had produced Vance Pruitt. Zeke asked about the commission, and Loretta said, "He wants to come to the next public meeting. Tell him to come." Calvin said, "We need people there." Marjorie finished her cornbread and handed the plate back to Loretta with a thank you that was simple and genuine. She looked at Calvin. "The neighborhood feels different this spring," she said. Calvin looked around Maplewood Court. He considered this honestly. "Does it?" he said. "Lighter." Marjorie said, "Like something that was sitting on it isn't sitting on it anymore." He thought about that. He thought about the years of it, the stops he had been told about, the ones he hadn't, the people who had filed complaints and been turned away, the slow erosion of a neighborhood's relationship with the authority that was supposed to serve it. He thought about Sawyer Tillman, the teenager with the phone across the street that morning, who had sent a letter some time ago saying he was applying to pre-law programs and that the morning had clarified for him what he wanted to spend his time doing. "Maybe," Calvin said, "we'll see what the next spring looks like." Marjorie nodded. She walked back to her house with the particular unhurried pace of a woman who has somewhere to be and is taking her time getting there. Loretta went inside. The mockingbirds resumed their argument in the live oak. Calvin picked up his washcloth. He worked the Chevelle's passenger door in slow, even circles, the soap running off the curves in the clean, unhurried way of something that has enough time to do the job properly. The radio in the garage had moved on to something else, Aretha Franklin, "Respect," which hit the spring morning with the specific, irreducible joy of a song that has never once suggested it might run out of reasons to be felt. The badge was in its velvet-lined box on the mantel in the front room. He had not surrendered it with his retirement paperwork. Retired officers kept their shields as a matter of departmental tradition, and Calvin had folded it into the box and placed it on the mantel. Not as a trophy and not as a monument, but in the way you keep something that represents the best of what you tried to be in a long stretch of complicated years. It was there on the mantel alongside a photograph from his youngest daughter's wedding and a ceramic pitcher that Loretta's mother had given them, and a small framed card that his elder daughter had made him when she was young that said in unsteady crayon letters, "My dad is the best policeman," which he had kept for years, not because it was literally true, but because it was the truest thing he knew how to aspire to. He worked the mitt over the chrome of the rear bumper, the circles slow and steady, the soap lifting the remnants of winter from the metal. The spring morning continued its quiet, generous progress around him. The child somewhere around the bend of the cul-de-sac was attempting the slope again with the training wheel bicycle, the aluminum frame scraping the asphalt in unsteady, determined arcs. And Calvin listened to that small sound, the sound of someone practicing at something they have not yet mastered, refusing to stop and let it fill the morning alongside the Aretha Franklin and the mockingbirds, and the smell of carnauba wax and the particular warmth of a morning that was from every available angle entirely his own. Vance Pruitt had believed for some years, and up to the moment a gold shield caught the afternoon sun in a Cedarwood Heights driveway, that the badge on his chest was a guarantee. A guarantee that certain spaces were his to patrol, certain judgments were his to make, and certain people were obligated to yield to the authority he carried. He was wrong about every part of it, and the law he spent some years treating as a personal instrument became, with the indifferent precision of consequence, the exact instrument of his own undoing. Years and the permanent end of a career is what years of deliberate, institutionally protected predation costs when it finally encounters a man with both the knowledge to name it and the standing to ensure it is named loudly enough to matter. Calvin Ramsey did not win because he had a gold badge in the pocket of his work pants. He won because he had the discipline to remain entirely himself in a situation designed to diminish him. The wisdom to understand that the point of the confrontation was not the confrontation, but what it could be made to build afterward, and the courage to stay in the fight long after the driveway, building the structure that protects the next person who does not have a badge to flash, and the person after them, and everyone who filed a complaint that was never heard. He traded a gold shield for a commission chairmanship and an oak desk for the slower, harder work of rewriting the rules that let men like Pruitt feel untouchable for so long. If this story stayed with you, if the gold catching the light stayed with you, or Marjorie's coffee, or Pruitt's voice on that recording, or the sound of the baton hitting the concrete of a man's own driveway, tell us in the comments. What was the moment that got you? We read everyone. And if you want more stories where the truth finally gets the room it deserves, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. The next one is already on its way.